Hi, this is Maria Williams. In this video, I'm going to show you how I combined 3 different embossing powders, gold, silver, and copper, not just on one card, but also on one sentiment, to create a simple but beautiful wedding card. The supplies I'm using for this card are the Any Occasion stamp set, which is a free stamp set during celebration. I'm going to use the Congratulations and the Mr. and Mrs. as well as the line and the little kind of tassel. I'm going to use that for the bottoms of the balloons. And then for the sentiment, I'm using the Better Together stamp set. There are 2 different wedding sentiments, but I'm going to use the one that says All the Best for a Future Filled with Love. The paper I'm using is the Falling in Love Designer Series paper pack. These papers are beautiful, perfect for Valentine's Day cards, wedding cards, but they're also great for birthdays. So I'm showing you the fronts of the paper. Well, really one side. There is no front and back, but one side of the paper and then the other side of the paper. And for this card, I'm going to also use a little bit of Sahara Sand and Sweet Sugar Plum cardstock. Since there is so much embossing on this card, you definitely want to have some kind of an embossing buddy. I've had mine for a really long time, and it is key to eliminate the static and keep the background of the card nice and clean. And I'm going to be using only Versamark ink, no other ink, and then my gold, silver, and copper embossing powders. I already did a little bit of a test run with the stamps and my embossing powders, and on this one I used the 3 different embossing colors for the balloons, but I've decided that I'm only going to use 2. I had a little trouble getting the lines that the letters are supposed to be hanging from perfectly aligned with the sentiments. So I'm going to use my Stamp-A-Majig only for that line. I'm just going to freehand the sentiments, but for the line I'm using the Stamp-A-Majig. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my template. I don't know what I've done with my plastic sheet, so I'm just using a scrap of vellum to do this and some black archival ink. I now need to clean my stamp really well because I'm going to be going from black archival ink to Versamark, which is clear, and I don't want to dirty my pad. And recently I've been using one of these absorber towels. I have really enjoyed using it. When I'm stamping, I do still often use my Stampin' Scrubber when I'm done with everything, but in between it really works out well, and you'll see when I stamp on the Versamark when I ink up my stamp on the Versamark that there is absolutely no residue, and all the absorber has on it is water. So I have already gone ahead and prepped my piece of cardstock with the embossing buddy in preparation for embossing. And I'm inking the Congratulations stamp, and I'm using the grid lines on my paper as my guide. So I'm making sure that my paper is nicely lined up. I like to have that thicker line going down the center of my paper. And then, like I said, I'm just using the horizontal lines as a guide to stamp my first sentiment. The key to keeping this card nice and clean and neat is going to be to kind of emboss as we go. So it is key to work slowly and to be patient. It's not a difficult card to make. It's just that it would be easy to mess up the embossing by trying to do too many images at one time in different colors, and then if you just barely brush it, the powder will come off, and then you might end up with a mess. So just take your time, work slowly, and just kind of emboss as you go. Another thing that will be really important for this card, since we are embossing multiple times on the same piece of cardstock, is to let your heat tool get really hot before you apply it to the paper. And I think that I have mentioned in a previous video that I like to use a pan, and lately I've been using these magnet remnants from the sheets of magnet that I use to store my dies to hold my paper in place. And this is really handy if you have more than one piece of cardstock that you have to emboss. You don't have to hold it in your hand and let the paper kind of flop around. You can just put multiple pieces in the pan and hold them down with the magnets and emboss them all at one time. So I'm moving on to the second sentiment that says Mr. and Mrs. And I want to use 3 different embossing powders on the one sentiment. So I'm going to start out with the gold, which is what the missus is going to be embossed with. And I'm just going to very carefully put my paper over my container with the embossing and just very carefully try to get it only on the part that says missus. What I should have done next is I should have put the copper embossing powder on the mister on the other side, but for some reason I went ahead and started heat embossing this, and I decided to go ahead and finish it and see what happened, see if the Versamark dried out. And as you will see, I was actually able to put the copper embossing powder on the mister and it still stuck. I don't recommend you do this, so if you keep watching, I'll show you how to put all three powders on at one time without embossing in between. But anyway, I did the copper, and since both those, the mister and the missus, are both covered now with embossing powder, I can go ahead and just add the silver in the middle without being careful because it won't stick to the other words. And now that the whole sentiment has powder on it, I'm just taking my hot embossing tool and heating that up and melting it. As I promised earlier, I'm going to show you how I recommend you put the embossing powders on. So I'm going ahead and prepping my piece of cardstock with my embossing buddy, inking up my Mr. and Mrs. stamp with the Versamark ink and stamping it onto the paper. And taking the gold embossing powder, and I'm sorry I'm making this look so awkward. I should have put the powder to my right. And grabbing a piece of cardstock, placing it between the and the misses, and using it as a barrier so the embossing powder doesn't get on any other part of the sentiment. When I remove the piece of cardstock, I'm just pushing lightly to the right as I pull it up so that when I remove the paper, the embossing powder just doesn't fall to the left and onto the part that is not embossed. I missed a little bit of the M, so I'm just going ahead and doing the same thing, but making sure that I get the embossing powder on the M. And as you will see, I did not get any embossing powder anywhere other than the misses. Next, I'm going to take the silver embossing powder and once again scoop some up, get my piece of cardstock, place it between the mister and the ampersand, and I'm just dumping the embossing powder over the ampersand, and then when I remove the piece of cardstock, just kind of moving it up and to the right. And then finally, I'm taking the copper embossing powder, and of course I don't need my little blocking piece of cardstock, so I'm just putting the powder on the mister. And then I just take the piece of cardstock and my embossing tool and melt the powder. I'm moving on to the heart-shaped balloons, and I've decided to leave all the silver embossing for last. So I'm inking up my stamp that came from the Bloom in Love stamp set with the Versamark ink, and I stamped the first one in the middle, eyeballing it, and then I'm stamping one on either side. If you don't have the Blooming Love stamp set, you could of course use any other heart stamp. And if you don't have a heart stamp, you could either use a stencil to sponge the Versamark ink onto the cardstock, or you could even punch out a heart if you have a punch and use that punched out piece of paper as your template. I'm covering all three balloons with copper embossing powder, and I'm going to heat set those. And move on to the gold balloons. So I've just stamped two more hearts in between the other three, and I am covering those with gold embossing powder. Once again, I'm going to take my heat tool and melt that down and move on to the silver embossing. Since my piece of cardstock has warped a little bit from all the embossing, I'm using a couple of pieces of washi tape that I'm pressing against my fingers a couple of times to anchor and straighten the piece of cardstock on my work surface. And I'm using the embossing buddy one more time just to counteract any kind of fingerprints I may have gotten on the cardstock. I'm bringing in my Stamp-A-Majig so that I can do the lines first, and unfortunately I can't do both of them at one time since they're too close together. So I'm starting with the top line, just aligning it with the congratulations, and you will see when I ink up my line stamp with the Versamark ink, there's no black residue at all. That absorber cloth did a great job cleaning the stamp. So I've stamped my line. I am going to add silver embossing powder and use my heat tool to set that. And then I'm doing the same thing for the second line. To keep the video going a little bit faster, I didn't use my pan every single time, but if I wasn't doing this on camera, I definitely would have kept it on my desk and used it every time I did some embossing. So anyway, I'm moving on now to the little, I guess they're streamers, not, you could use them as a tassel, but I guess in this case they would be streamers, and I'm stamping all of them at one time. And once again, adding the silver embossing powder and heat setting those. And then finally, I am taking my stamp that I use for the curved lines, and the stamp comes as a curve, but I'm straightening out on my block, and I'm going to use it for the strings of the balloons. So one last time, I'm stamping with Versamark ink, adding silver embossing powder, and using my embossing tool. And I'm sorry if this part of the video is a little bit repetitive, but I just wanted you to see how I completed this panel and the order that I stamped everything in. I used the embossing buddy one last time all over the card just in case there was any little bit of sticky residue from the washi tape, and I just think the results are beautiful. I just love the way metallic embossing looks. The assembly of this card is really simple, but since I want my panel to be really nice and flat, I'm using a piece of fun foam, and I'm just marking the edges of my panel onto it. I want it to be just a little bit smaller than my panel. So I'm going to cut inside those lines, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch inside the line that I've already marked. And then I'm just going to use some strong adhesive. I don't recommend using snail or a regular tape runner. I'm using fast fuse for this situation, and I'm putting the fast fuse on the fun foam, which I actually would recommend that you put the fast fuse on your cardstock because it will stick a little bit better right off the bat. And the other thing to remember with the fast fuse that I didn't do for the first couple of strips that I put on is you do have to sort of do that sort of quick motion to the right or to the left away from the fast fuse. If you just keep going off your paper or off the fun foam, it'll just kind of form a string and you'll have a mess. So as you can see, it works really well on the cardstock. It wasn't as easy on the fun foam, but it will hold really well. So I'm taking my panel and I'm mounting it onto a slightly larger piece of Sahara sand cardstock, and then mounting all of that onto a larger piece of sweet sugar plum cardstock. I have a piece of the designer series paper that I've cut to 5.5 by 4.25, which are the same dimensions as the card front, and I'm just adhering that with some snail. And since I already have some dimension with the fun foam, I'm just going to attach the center panel to the card using some fast fuse instead of dimensionals. For the inside of the card, I've cut a panel of Whisper White cardstock to 5 1/8 by 3 7/8, and I am anchoring it to my work surface with a little bit of washi tape, the same one I used before, and using my Stamp-A-Majig to stamp the sentiment with Versamark ink at the top of the piece of cardstock in the middle. And then I'm going to use the copper embossing powder to emboss the sentiment. I then just add the sentiment panel into the inside of my card with a few strips of snail, and my card is complete. I hope you like this idea of combining metallics on a single card and that you will give it a try with whatever metallics you have, or maybe with different colors of embossing powder. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you would like to see more pictures or purchase any of the products used in this video, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thanks for watching!